Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will be talking about how Passwordless takes center stage for next generation of authentication. I am Bojan Simic, and I'm joined by Jim Routh. We will be discussing a couple of use cases today. Jim will be talking about the consumer side for next generation authentication and some of the great work that he's done on that side of things. And I will be talking about the workforce and enterprise side of the house a bit as well. So I will kick it off to Jim to start us off.
Hey, Boyan, thank you very much. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. So I'm going to talk about next generation authentication. And what I got to start with is kind of where do we have problems today? And the problems today are largely in passwords, but it's not entirely passwords. It's actually passwords and people, the combination, because passwords have served us well for the last 60 years in terms of enterprise protection in the online world. So it's really not a defect in passwords. It's a defect in how passwords are used by people. And what's happened is people like you and I have multiple websites, mobile properties, and digital assets that we have to remember passwords for. And in many cases, it's over 100. And the reality is we can't remember all those passwords. So what do? We reuse passwords. And we'll reuse patterns and variations so we can remember them, because, it's really frustrating getting to a web page and then having to say, oh, geez, what's the password? Oh, I don't remember. I don't use this site very often, maybe 6-7 times a year. I'm either going to just do password reset, or I'm going to use a simple password that I can remember. And because I don't really care about the information that I'm, in my rental car, website. So I'm just going to go with an easy password. And all of us make that trade-off simply because it's more convenient and there's friction associated with the password that we're trying to avoid. So the reality is that criminals figured this out, about 5 or 6 years ago, and they created automation and some data science to make this easier to essentially do credential stuffing, to exploit the fact that they can opportunistically try credentials across different websites, and they're going to get a hit. In other words, about 2% of the time, they're going to own the account. And it's much easier to own the account when you have the authentication mechanism that's legitimate as a criminal. And so that's really what's happening. And it's leading to just the growing obsolescence of passwords. So essentially, what I'm asking you to do to think about authentication differently is to unlearn something. And the question is, well, what are we unlearning? Well, when I learned IT, and it was a long time ago, and when all of you learned IT, that may or may not have been as long a time ago, but in the past, we learned that authentication was an event, and it had a beginning and an end, and a predetermined binary outcome. You're either accepted and trusted in the environment or not, one or the other. And the event itself was called authentication. And so what has evolved over time is adding binary authentication mechanisms into that event. And we, as enterprise providers of information to consumers, have looked to make trade-off decisions as to the level of friction that we're willing to introduce for the customer and the impact on the threat actor. But the customer always had some friction that they had to deal with. And the more sensitive the information, the more friction that we introduced. And that was the trade-off. And that's what we've been operating with for a long time. And frankly, what's grown out, what we've grown out of is the fact that there's just too many websites, too many digital properties to remember passwords for. So what I'm asking you to do is think about authentication as a continuous process. It doesn't have a beginning and an end and a binary outcome. It's something where you're capturing information on online behavior consistently, and then you're using that to do continuous authentication. So it's not based on a binary outcome, or it's not based on a single attribute, in this case, a credential. And that kind of changes the game. So it's based on a fundamental construct of data science that actually is relatively straightforward and somewhat simple. And it's based on this. We can represent any event numerically by putting it on a graph, XY axis. And because of that, we can establish a pattern of events, a set of events that fall into a pattern. And that pattern is represented mathematically. So if we're streaming data in real time and using the same attribute information compared to the pattern, we can determine a deviation score. Like how closely does that new set of attributes map to the pattern? And if it's a real close map, then we can represent that numerically and share that information with orchestration and workflow engines in our enterprise to ultimately set a threshold of deviation score that allows electronic interaction and then potentially has step-up authentication if the deviation score goes beyond the threshold. But the whole point is it's based on this simple construct of we're just measuring events against a pattern and determining whether that pattern is matched, and if so, how closely it matches. And we're doing that across attributes. So if we introduce that into an authentication architecture, this is an actual architecture that I've implemented previously, and it's in place. It's being put in place today for MassMutual, and that's a security data lake. So this is a data lake dedicated to security information and a streaming capability. In this case, we're using Kafka, you use NiFi and other streaming capabilities. And essentially, you have a risk engine that's taking the input, taking the data, and doing that pattern matching and that deviation scoring that we talked about. And essentially, we're calling that the risk engine. And then you have to do some identity proofing on top of that. And then we have FIDO as a set of authenticators that can give the consumer a choice of what biometric controls on their device that they wish to use. And consumer choice is the real big part of that, because as consumers make their choices and decisions and technology evolves in terms of endpoint capabilities, we have a single standard that allows us to take that outcome, feed it into our risk engine as an authenticator to determine that the authentication matches our risk tolerance. And essentially the only emphasis here is the behavioral information that we capture means that we have to combine that with a pretty certain identity proofing capability through an identity provider to make sure that whoever's registering for the online account, that we're matching the behaviors to the registrant, and that's kind of important. So that's essentially, this is an enterprise-wide view at doing authentication for consumers that you can also use internally as well. So it manifests itself in an employee perspective, and this is what would be essentially the visual, and this is the beauty of the FIDO FIDO standard, is to allow a next generation authentication capability to be based on FIDO for consistency across different platforms, different devices, and ultimately removing the friction from the digital experience, which actually enhances the digital experience significantly. It's a lower cost because you're not paying for the infrastructure of password reset, and it's a better security model simply because we're using a number of different attributes in a continuous process that ultimately leads to better quality decisions in terms of authentication, and all of that at a lower cost. So it's a way of getting 3 dimensions of benefit here. So the improved security, better digital experience, those are the big drivers. It turns out it's lower cost from an operational cost perspective, and obviously improved compliance. So those are the 4 things that ultimately thinking differently about authentication allows us to accomplish, and that's what we're after.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim, so much. And I completely agree. These days, It's 100% about improving the user experience, and digital teams are always trying to figure out how to streamline the process, make life as frictionless as possible for everybody. Because, especially in the digital space, extra clicks, extra seconds, milliseconds sometimes amount to tens of millions of dollars in business potential or loss. So it's awesome to see FIDO and open standards being used in this way, and some of the adoption that we've seen across organizations over the last few years has been extremely compelling and really great to see. So thank you for that. I will switch over to my side of the conversation, which will include talking about Passwordless and FIDO in the enterprise. And as we know, enterprises typically have, a few decades of technologies still running at all times internally. And so we always kind of talk about when there is a new standard, how do we make this standard fit within the legacy technologies and the frameworks that organizations currently have implemented? So as Jim mentioned, at work today, most of us still use passwords. And everybody reads the Verizon data breach report that says, passwords are the cause of every single major breach that we see these days, pretty much, or 4 out of 5 of them. And, we need to kill this thing. And we've all been reading this report for the last decade. And things really haven't changed too much, unfortunately, but now they're really starting to. And this is because as organizations move everything from internal to the cloud, phishing attacks, credential stuffing become more and more of an issue. And organizations these days are spending more money than ever on things like identity proofing, password resets, lockouts, so on and so forth. And these things are typically very high costs for any organization, within the IT department in general, not just the security department itself. So one thing that I think everybody can agree upon is that open standards are the way forward. We've seen this with things like SAML and OpenID Connect. Over the last couple of decades, we have gone from the days where every single application that we use on a daily basis has its own password. And through single sign-on protocols, we've gotten down to one password in most cases, but most of us at work still use several for different services. And we've seen other open standards like DMARC and the fact that all of our browsers more or less function the same through W3C has been tremendous. I remember the days of, you have one engineering effort when you're creating an application for Internet Explorer and another one for, the other browsers. And it was very stressful as an engineer at that time to work on these applications. So open standards are definitely the way forward. But when we look at implementing open standards, there are always challenges within an organization. We get it, everybody's busy, right? Everybody's super busy all the time. They're just trying to get their job done. They're trying to move their organization forward. They're trying to make improvements. And when a new open standard comes along, there has to be significant benefit for it. And killing the password is definitely a significant benefit. But everybody has to be convinced of it and on the same page. And one of the great things that we see with FIDO in particular is it's one of the few times where our security leadership at organization can go to the IT departments, can go to the digital departments and say, I'm going to make us more secure, and everybody's going to love it. And that's so refreshing to see, and that's why I love working in this industry personally. However, with open standards also comes quite a bit of baggage sometimes. And what we see many times in terms of implementation of open standards, it's critical to have a really strict certification process. So one of the challenges that we've seen within enterprises who are looking to move forward with FIDO, who are looking to move forward with Passwordless, they will often see solutions out in the market, or they will look to implement FIDO, but only for a very small subset of use cases. And we think that this isn't good enough. We think that you should have no shared secrets, public key cryptography based authentication with FIDO for every single use case. And a lot of times you see kind of a single use case being implemented by either in-house teams or potentially even a vendor, and then everybody waves the flag like, hey, we've succeeded, but you still have all the passwords internally for 99% of the other applications that you may be using. And so it's really important when we talk to organizations that, hey, we want to get rid of the password. This thing needs to be FIDO certified, and killing the password for all of the use cases is very important. Otherwise, as long as there's a shared secret in there, the bad guys will still be able to get in. So when we look at enterprises, there's a whole set of challenges that simply don't exist in the consumer space, right? We have legacy infrastructure. We have things like remote desktop login. Everybody's working remotely these days, and IT teams are using RDP to log into people's machines from the other side of the country constantly. They just want to enable their workforce to their job. And we're seeing a lot of shortcuts being taken with regards to security around this in particular. So how do you make sure that when somebody's using a BYOD device or doing a remote desktop login, how can you make sure that that credential is not intercepted? We see people using VPN now more than ever. And how can you make sure that that channel is secure? We see interoperability issues with legacy protocols. Radius is a protocol that's over 30 years old now, and it's still being widely used at a lot of organizations. So how can an open standard that's only a few years old, that's based on public key cryptography, fit into that mold? And how can you make sure that it solves these use cases? Everybody's moving towards virtual desktop infrastructure. How can we address that? So there's just so many use cases within the enterprise, including the fact that large organizations typically have more than one identity provider. So their employees find themselves in a situation where they're using 2 or 3 different apps just to authenticate through different services, just to go about their day. And guess what? Their help desk and IT teams also have to worry about learning and training people to support 2 or 3 different applications to authenticate users. And FIDO and open standards give us a way to streamline the authentication process, give a user experience that is uniform across all of these identities, and just makes life easier for not just the end user, but also the workforce. And then there's always the operational hurdles, right? Public key cryptography-based authentication is not new. The government has been using it with common access cards and PIV credentials for decades. And now we're using FIDO authenticators. So operational hurdles around implementing FIDO do exist. What the common question is, what if I lose my phone, my token, my authenticator? What do I do then? And our answer to date, which I don't think is good enough, has been, well, register several authenticators. And if you lose one, then you can use the other. I think we need better solutions, and some of the working groups that we've gotten involved currently are looking to solve that very critical problem. And then how does FIDO fit into my onboarding, offboarding flows? I was talking to one organization recently, and I asked them, how are you onboarding people now that everybody's remote? And they said, well, we write a password on a piece of paper and we stick it under the laptop that we ship them. That's how they get into their account the first time. Well, if there is no password, how do you onboard and offboard users? How do you manage those credentials? How do you issue them for the first time? These problems are critical to solve, and organizations, don't really have the time. Everybody's busy all the time to worry about this themselves. They need to just make it work. And I think that the FIDO standard and everybody involved, the over 600 companies that are involved, need to be looking at this and finding ways to provide this out of the box. So there are also other key expectations that organizations have from FIDO and from passwordless authentication. And this is where I talked about the operational hurdles. The fact is, it must be 100% self-service. Any technology these days in the world of SaaS and cloud, if it's not self-service, it's not going to be deployed. If a reasonably mid-level IT person cannot sit there and deploy this to a small subset of users within a few minutes or a couple of hours, then you're going to have a very difficult time using this product. Not compromising on shared secrets. A lot of times you'll see a solution waving the FIDO certified flag, but then the thing that they actually provide isn't FIDO. And we need to make sure that we as a FIDO Alliance take the time and put together the materials to make sure that organizations know what's real and what isn't, because there is a lot of confusion in the market with regards to passwordless and authentication these days. And third, and I think, one of the most important things is moving the authentication to the edge, right? Historically, when you authenticate into a service, you type your password into your computer, and then you do a multi-factor authentication into your single sign-on or downstream services. And that's typically the multi-factor authentication edge has been at the browser. We need to move it to the operating system. If you have a strong multi-factor authentication that is public key cryptography based, doesn't have any shared secrets on your workstation itself, then you have a reasonable level of assurance, and through things like continuous authentication, you can continue to monitor that to make sure that, hey, I'm on this computer, I got access to it. Just by the fact that I got access to this operating system, I should have a very high level of assurance that it's me using all the downstream applications. And there are systems that you can have to monitor that continuously, as Jim mentioned. So the number one thing, though, that organizations really care about when it comes to passwordless, and for some reason this isn't super obvious to a lot of people, it has to be fast. If your passwordless solution takes longer than the password, people aren't going to use it. They're going to get it in their hand. They're going to be like, what is this? This doesn't make sense. You're eliminating the password, but it still takes me longer to log in every single day. And I log in multiple times a day. So we have to think about the user. We have to think about the accessibility. Passwords, for all their faults, if you're a person who is hard of hearing or has visual problems, you can still log in most of the time. These problems have been solved for the password over the last 60 years. When we look at passwordless, how can you log in very quickly and reliably and not have to worry about all the downstream effects? And so as part of the FIDO Alliance and as part of the FIDO standard, we're always looking at the user experience. And there is a user experience working group, if anybody is interested in joining, where we look specifically at the user experience of the end user and how their expectations are with regards to removing passwords in FIDO, because it's not always so obvious for us who live and breathe this stuff every single day. It's obvious for us, but it's not for them. So the number one thing that we've seen is anytime somebody deploys a passwordless solution, the end users will revolt if it's slower than the password. So the average password takes, if it's over 10 characters, reasonably complex, 5.5 seconds to type in. That means your passwordless authentication needs to take less than that. And that's as far as the everyday knowledge worker end user, that is the most critical thing that we've seen. So thank you all so much. My and Jim's email are on here. If you have any questions, let us know. I really appreciate you listening in, and I'll look forward to further discussions.